How significant is it that progressive Democrats were trying to get Joe Biden's ear on this to make him wary of, it sounds like, what he's about to get into?
Yeah, I think that people have been very wary of the human rights abuses that Modi has inflicted on India. There have been a lot of crackdowns on people who are not Hindu there. I think that the thing that the White House is really trying to do is they're trying to counter other geopolitical forces. So we have Russia invading Ukraine. That has sort of really scrambled the world order. And also there is just such a rising influence of China. And I think that Biden is trying to build different coalitions, keep NATO together and build a stronger alliance with India to really counter the rising economic power of China.
Well, of course, as we talk about countering China and the efforts there is also, though, Enda, the question around India's closeness with Russia. Purchasing oil from Russia, for example, and the war in Ukraine. We did actually hear from the Indian Prime Minister about the war in Ukraine earlier today at the White House. Just take a listen, if we can, to what he had to say.
From the very beginning of the events in Ukraine, India has laid emphasis on resolution of dispute through dialogue and diplomacy. We are completely ready to contribute in any way we can to restore peace.
So maybe that is encouraging a bit for the Biden administration, but I guess, Enda, there's a question on whether you can push India away from China, but less so easily Russia.
Yeah, I think India will plough its own furrow. I mean, they certainly have not taken the same stance that the Western world has against Ukraine, continue to buy, of course, Russian oil. They haven't joined those sanctions, for example. And at the same time, though, India is trying to position itself, it's trying to leverage itself off the negative geopolitical sentiment against China and Russia by setting itself up as a place to do business, foreign money going to the stock market, foreign money going to the bond market, some foreign money going into setting up factories as well. So it's trying to play a bit of both worlds here. It has a long-standing legacy trade relationship with Russia. It hasn't jeopardised that. And, of course, at the same time, trying to pitch itself to the rest of the world now as a place to do business other than China.
President Biden said today he's hoping to meet soon with President Xi, which was a headline that came out of the news conference. Nancy, I just wonder, though, to what extent is this administration sending the signal, coming off this meeting with Antony Blinken, that it's giving up on China?
I don't think that it's giving up on China. I think that the tensions have become so high over the last 2 years, particularly given President Biden's comments around Taiwan and saying, multiple times that he would come to Taiwan's defense and then having people in the White House having to walk that back. And so I think that they're just trying to bring the temperature down on that relationship a bit while keeping the lines of communication open. But I wouldn't say it's like a warm relationship at this point, not at all. And that's certainly something, at this point, I think the White House just wants to establish some clear lines of communication with China.
Of course, as the White House navigates all of these geopolitical issues, they have to navigate the ones here at home as well, including the persistent inflation issue here in the U.S. And of course, that was the subject of the debate on Capitol Hill before Modi arrived there, when Jerome Powell was there in the Senate Banking Committee talking about macroeconomic policy. And I caught up with a few senators who sit on the committee about what exactly the Fed's conundrum is here. Take a listen.
The Fed does have a dual mandate. And sometimes we forget about the other part of the mandate. As I just asked Chairman Powell, we see rising numbers of unemployment women and African Americans. At some point, you have to worry in that dual mandate. What's your calibration?
They shouldn't be fighting the inflation battle so hard that it ends up destroying the American economy and putting 10 million people out of work. I think they're right really on the edge of going a little too far here.
On the edge of going too far, and yet, Enda, in his testimony today, Chairman Powell said they are really trying not to go too far. And when asked if he thought they could get inflation down without hurting America's middle class, he said, I do think we can do that. But it's a very little needle that he has to thread.
It is. He's been a true believer for a while now that they can maybe pull this off, the soft landing. And of course, if they do, that would defy all the skeptics. There's no doubt the labour market has held up much better than expected, even as they push up interest rates. But at the same time, Chairman Powell has made clear, if you're worried about borrowing costs, his message is that they are going up. They're not finished their job yet. So that risk of maybe doing too much has still got to be a live one, not just for the economy, but it may become a political issue as well then.
To what extent are Joe Biden's re-election fortunes based on the work of Jay Powell? The White House will not talk about the Fed. We try every day. It's an independent Fed. You know that. Don't even bring it up. But this is the most important issue, arguably, when it comes to the economy that he'll be dealing with for the next year.
Well, I think that typically voters do vote along pocketbook issues. What are the prices of things?
Yeah.
How do they feel about their wages? What are gas prices like? However, what we saw in the 2022 midterms was that Democratic voters were also very motivated by issues of access to abortion, democracy, things that, were sort of outside of the traditional economic realm. And I think that that's the question heading into 2024. How much is this an election about the economy, and how much is it an election about some of the culture war issues that Republicans are talking about, and then some of the issues that Biden is going to talk about, like Social Security, Medicare, and abortion?
Is banking regulation a big issue for the American voting populace? Because judging from the number of questions lawmakers had for Powell on that issue, Nancy, you would think so.
Well, I think what is so interesting about particularly the Republican field this time is that they are talking about very seemingly wonky issues. They're talking about ESG investing on the campaign trail. Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, talked about crypto policy in his Twitter Spaces launch. And so these are sort of things that are usual to the Bloomberg audience, but atypical for, the regular voter out there. And so I think that we are seeing sort of a wide expanse of economic issues talked about rather than just, harping on inflation and talking about things like that.